Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for joining this webinar, Getting Serious About Living, 1.5-degree Living and Opportunities from Visionaries in a Post-COVID World. Welcome to all you, and welcome also to our speakers who you'll be hearing from shortly. My name is Andrew Schmidt. I work with the Secretariat of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production at the UN Environment Program, and I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction so that we can get into the webinar as quickly as possible. First of all, just on a technical note, you'll notice that your microphones are on mute. If you'd like to intervene, that is encouraged. We just ask that you please use the question box, which you should see on your little dashboard on the right side of your screen. And then the moderator will be kind of pulling those together, and we'll be trying to get to as many of those as possible. So, like I said, I'm just going to take a minute or two of your time to go briefly over the One Planet Network, which most of you are probably already familiar with. It supports the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production, the 10YFP, which was adopted at the Rio Plus 20 Sustainable Development Conference in 2012 by member states to help them in their transitions to producing and consuming more sustainably. As SCP is such a vast topic, in order to break it down into more tangible pieces, there is a series of programs, and one of those is the Sustainable Lifestyles and Education Program, whose actors you'll be hearing from throughout the webinar today. That particular program is co-led by the Ministry of Environment of Sweden through the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. There's more information about the One Planet Network and all of the programs on our website if you're interested. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Garrett Clark, who will be moderating the discussion today and also introducing the webinar. She is a program officer for Sustainable Lifestyles at the UN Environment Program. And she'll be, again, moderating this discussion for the next, I think, hour and a quarter or so. So, Garrett, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew, and thanks to the One Planet Network for hosting this first kickoff webinar of the broader series, Sustainable Living 1.5, Empowering People to Live Better and Lighter. And I'm really delighted to be here. I am the UN Environment Sustainable Lifestyles Program Officer, so I'm all about everything that's sustainable lifestyles. What's the evidence that's out there about how we can live better, lighter, and more sustainably in a more inclusive engagement? For me, that's all about what I'm doing, but let me also welcome our panelists briefly, because in a sense, in their own rights, they're also deeply engaged in sustainable living and promoting positive behavior change. So welcome, Louis. You want to wave and say hello to everyone? Louis Akenji, Malin, Peterson Beckman from IKEA, and Claire Tavernier. Hello. And let me also take the time to thank all of you for joining us for this kickoff webinar, because I know there's a lot of competition out there for your time and energy. We hope that this is only the first of many webinars that you'll be joining us for. And so today's title, the webinar, is Getting Serious About Living, and I cannot imagine a more apt description about how globally we have all been dealing with these special times under the global pandemic. And so first I'm going to make a few opening comments about the UNEP context and introduce the broader webinar series, and then outline the agenda and what we're going to be doing today. So in context, even before COVID came on the scene, issues in the media and how we would all been seeing how we live had seen a lot more engagement about how we could be more sustainable in how we live. The media showed us how we could eat differently, move differently, rethink our quality of life differently. But in a sense, we heard many things about different aspects of our lives, but how globally and holistically we could live better and lighter, and how it resonated with everyone on the planet were still questions that were out there. Now with COVID, we have found that with the concerns around health and well-being, this increase has skyrocketed. Now, I'm sure none of you would be surprised to know that a Google search engine looking at the question how to live more sustainably over a set period of time when many people across the world were in confinement or hearing about confinement, found that it had an increase of over 4,550%. Now imagine that. That was only that one specific phrase. And imagine all the variations on how we actually live our lives in a daily basis. But we don't really need to look look to the media to tell us that people have been affected and are changing how they're living in these unprecedented times. We are part of the story, exchanging with family, friends, colleagues about how we're doing and how we're doing things differently, what's working and what isn't, and what's really important to us. And we see in social media, Instagram and TikTok for the young and Facebook for the young at heart, we see how people are coping, handling, struggling, and sharing within their family contexts, living. It's an unprecedented time that we have a visual narrative around how people are living on a global level. We also see the underpinning story of the connections between COVID-19 and sustainability, whether it's affecting climate and biodiversity, and we see that there's a potential to harness some of this openness for change for building back better. And many people around the world are re-examining how we live and questioning how we can emerge as a healthy, resilient, and prosperous society. Looking at healthcare systems, but as well the many interlinked systems that meet all of our daily needs and enable us to live our lives. Choices of work, education, play, the importance of family, well-being, and for many we have to take into account that even living and meeting basic needs are increasingly challenging. So in looking at the COVID-19 context, we recognize that there's a need that we can and must change as we build back better. Putting people and communities, which also references inclusion and equity at the center, are a part of many of the global dialogues and exchanges that we hear. We know that behavior and economies can alter quickly to secure human welfare, but part of that requires concerted action based on science, leadership, and normalizing motivated behavior change. For UNEP's part, we're working on building our work on sustainable living and smart choices, focusing on insights from COVID-19 with an emphasis on health, well-being, and relationships, including those working with nature. And we use efforts like low carbon lifestyle challenges and campaigns to support healthier working lives. Now, taking into account that even people who want to live lighter, better, more healthy, more sustainably, often lack affordable, effective, and alternatives. Work also needs to go beyond individuals and target working with governments and business who can promote and set the context for more positive behavior change, providing information, supporting new business models, and engaging and motivating for change. Now, we looked at those who have applied and are attending this webinar, and we note that many of you are already perhaps familiar with the sustainability world in general. So let me offer a few general comments about sustainable living in general to set some contexts. Remember that sustainable living is somewhat new on the sustainability agenda, emerging from the important work around sustainable consumption and production. It applies a people's lens to sustainability, coming up in different kinds of global contexts. It appears twice within the Sustainable Development Goals around education and responsible consumption and production. But for many people working in sustainability, much of the work that's going on looks at material flows, environmental impacts, whether it's climate, biodiversity, waste, or water, and focuses on policymakers and intermediaries who influence policy. So keep in mind that when you think about what is a people lens, most people don't wake up in the morning and think about sustainability, Most people wake up in the morning and think about getting something to eat, getting their kids ready for school, living their lives. And it's this lens that the webinar series, and this one in particular will be kicking off, is looking at how we can vision and see what sustainable living can do. So in essence, could I see the next slide, please? To focus on this, the overall broader webinar series, Sustainable Living, Empowering People to Live Back Better, looks into the core elements of how we can better understand and operationalize what sustainable living is all about. So there are 4 areas, and this first kickoff webinar, looking at core visions and leadership, is looking at what is the case for sustainable lifestyles and people-centric approaches. There's a second group of webinars that will be looking at creating and motivating and celebrating change, existing good practices and replication, and deep dives about how we are working in specific sectors of our lives and how we can live better and lighter. Finally, there's also a number that are going to be focusing on impactful tools and resources that are already out there that can be applied for this. And so with this in mind, let's get down to the work at hand. The webinar today will be, today's webinar will be looking particularly at the key elements I mentioned earlier about the importance of the evidence around what is sustainable living, what is the leadership around sustainable living, and how we can normalize and motivate behavior change. So in essence, today's webinar has invited leaders from each of these fields to kick off the series and offer their visions on sustainable living. And the presenters are going to offer visions on what is sustainable living and COVID-19 trends. How can business contribute to building back better with a people-centric approach? And how can media motivate the needed transformational change? And so our first speaker will be Louis Akenji, and each of the speakers will be speaking for about 10 minutes. And if you have any questions or any issues, please write them into the question box, and we'll discuss those at the end of the presentations. So before turning to Louis, he is a member of the NGO Hot and Cool, which is a community of experts in the sustainable living field, and a lead author on many cornerstone research documents, including a framework for shaping sustainable lifestyles and 1.5 sustainable lifestyles. Louis, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? I'm hoping you don't see too many things on my screen, but
just the PowerPoint. It looks good.
All right. Just give me a while I try to get this right. Oh. All right. Thank you so much. Drew, can you confirm you can hear me?
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for coming to this today. I really excited to be a part of this, and thank you, UNEP and One Planet, for putting this together. My name is Louis Akenji. I'm Executive Director of SEED, and I'm also a member of the Hot and Cool network, which Garrett has introduced. What I'd like to do today is talk about a number of things. The first one is to show the urgency of the issue that we have ahead of us when we talk about sustainable lifestyles, primarily because we always seem to underestimate it. The second one is to show some of the tensions that we find in our understanding of sustainable lifestyles and how we're pursuing solutions. And the last part, I will show a few of the lessons that we're getting out of COVID-19 and how we can apply them to the sustainable living lens. So first, I'll start with the magnitude, the scale, and the urgency of sustainable lifestyles, the transitioning. And I'll draw on the 1.5-degree lifestyles report. I'm sure quite a good number of you are familiar with it. It looked at the Paris Agreement on climate change, and it said if we have a certain carbon budget, which we all have left before we exhaust the chances of staying below 1.5 degrees lifestyles, it then asks the question, what is the contribution of lifestyles to this? and what changes, what magnitude changes in sustainable living bring towards meeting this target. What we did then is distribute the emissions that we have, the budget that we have equitably across the globe, and we ended up having what we call a lifestyle carbon footprint. This is not just a carbon footprint as you know it. It is emissions from lifestyles directly by households, but excluding capital formation and government consumption. And what it shows is that we're currently around 4.5 tons per person per year. What I would encourage you to do is to look at the green line. That's really the line where lifestyle changes without the support of technology is taking place. We're currently at 4.5 tons per person per year. By 2050, we need to go down to 0.7 tons per person per year. And in the meantime, within the next 10 years, we need to go down from 4.5 to 3 tons per person. Now, I'll show you a few countries we looked at and analyzed and what this actually means in terms of their transition into sustainable lifestyles. We looked at 5 different countries from both industrialized and industrializing countries: Finland, Japan, China, Brazil, and India, just to get a broader global picture. And you can already see here that the areas that contribute the most, the hotspots here are around how we meet our needs for food and nutrition, housing, mobility, consumer goods, including say fashion and leisure and services. Finland, for example, is currently at about 10.4 tons per person per year, and India is at about 2.0 tons per person per year. But if we're to meet the 2030 target, that's in 10 years time of 3 tons, you already see that Finland needs to be thinking of going down by more than 70%, and China also by more than 30%. But what about by 2050? If we need to go to the 2050 target, we're looking at a 90% reduction for countries like Finland. And Finland is not the only country here. I feel bad for pronouncing Finland all the time when there are so many countries in this category. But there's something even more interesting. There are countries like China, Brazil, India, which represent industrializing economy, that still need to get billions of people out of poverty to meet their basic needs. And just in terms of emissions, they need to start thinking about reduction, sometimes as much as more than 70% compared to where they need to be by 2050. Now, what are these numbers telling us? One of the first things that becomes very obvious is that we can't have it all, right? So we need to give up something. And the sooner we understand what we need to give up, the better. It's also not just about giving up, it's also about finding new ones to replace the needs that we have currently. It also means that all those small action traps, or those small actions where we're trapped around changing light bulbs, if we just end there, that is not the entirety of the picture. We won't make it through the distance that these numbers show. And that we need to start prioritizing the kind of actions that generate momentum and grow bigger, and looking at experimentation that have a higher return potential. These are really things that we've not been tinkering with before. But where are the tensions we have in how we are approaching this? What are some of the false dichotomies? How are we falsely juxtaposing things that we really should not be juxtaposing? I'll touch on a few of those as we go through here. The first one is whether we should look at individual change or systemic or structural change. And what this diagram shows you is that people pretty much live within several circles, some of which they have control over, and some of which they have very little or no control. At the very inner core of it, we have basic needs and desires, which like affection, participation in society, understanding. But as this circle grows a little bit bigger towards the personal situation, these are things like your income, your gender, your age, what level of education you have, you start getting less and less control. But as it widens even more to the socio-technical conditions, these are the politics of the country, the existing infrastructure, the policies of the government and the economy, you have fairly little control there. So it's not an either or. We need individual change as well as structural change. And what we're seeing is that individual change reinforces acceptance of the need for structural and systemic change. The next one, of course, is that we constantly say sustainability or going fast towards sustainability is going to cost us jobs and so on. But as this diagram is showing very clearly, almost all our needs are subordinated to the economic system, how we go around looking for needs. And if we don't have an economy, we won't have jobs. So that's really just an argument that shouldn't be on the table. But where we have the next tension is where I think is very interesting. We constantly talk about buying green and buying products. So much focus on products and consumption that we forget about living in itself. There's things like love, there's things like community, there's things like sharing, there are even robbers and poets and artists, and this all constitute what living is. Focusing exclusively on products doesn't give the completion of the picture, and in fact, it confines us to just what the marketplace can provide. It is also an argument that I think has been brought forward by how we went about scientifically in understanding the hotspots in sustainable consumption through value chains. What science has helped us through the material flow analysis is to really know which areas have high impact. And this is quite important. But we need to start shifting and looking at how people are spending time. What are the power dynamics in society? What are the other levers that we can push that can allow for quicker and more rapid transition than necessarily focusing on the hotspots of products, where sometimes the ones that consume or are most visible are not necessarily the ones that have the power to change the system. And this is what people would typically go when we're seeing a supermarket. If they're talking about, if we're only confined to product orientation, it leads to lots of paralysis and people even being overwhelmed by the messages that we are putting out there. Now, the last but not the least tension here is looking at a comparison that is always made between developed and developing countries, whether we should focus on one or the other. I would say that that shouldn't really be an issue. We've looked at this with UNEP in as far as just as recently as 2 years ago, asking experts in foresight studies, what changes can we anticipate in 2050? Mind you, this was even before the corona situation. And I will show you 2 examples here. One of them is changes from an environmental and resource constraint perspective. And you can already see the centers here where we would have conflicts: food security, resource consumption, population movement, natural disasters, including, of course, COVID, and so on. This is what is going to shape future society, and this is not restricted to North or South. Now, let's look at shifts in culture and values. We have at the very center here polarization in society due to different orientations and value systems, due to differences in how we're educating people, but also because things like digitalization and social media are playing up how we see equity or lack of equity in the world. All of these are not relevant to either developed or developing countries. It is in the case of both. And we have a situation where we have a growing middle class in some developing countries that is consuming even more than in industrialized countries. And we have poverty manifesting very rapidly in what we used to call industrialized countries. Now, I don't know how much time I have, so I'm just going to quickly rush through what lessons we got from COVID-19. The first one is the one thing we need to avoid is the pain that came with it. This is the importance of a planned transition versus a chaotic transition, as we're seeing in the case of the lockdown pretty much being dumped on people. The first thing we need to examine here is contracted time. This pretty much looks at a job situation and how and employment circumstances. We need to avoid the tendency to hang on to old jobs and say we're protecting them, but rather start looking at new opportunities in an economy that is going to evolve. The second one is looking at revisiting labor and employment laws and standards and understanding where the lock-ins are. What contracts can obligate you to commute to work or to work from home, office spaces and how they're designed, and how much you're required to fly out of project because of work projects and so on. These are all things that add to your lifestyle carbon footprint. But we also have observed a lot about decentralization, such as work from home, and you all know about the movement to talk about shorter work weeks. The next one, of course, is beginning to reorient cities as centers of resilience and using this as a sort of entry point to sustainable lifestyle. This is because cities are really where investments in infrastructure take place. And we need to start thinking about an audit, whether the infrastructure we're investing in is future-proof and it is sustainable, or it is going to lock people into particular modes of consumption that are unsustainable. We also need to rethink the idea of zoning and neighborhoods. We need to start thinking about integrating live, work, and play zoning rules instead of ones where we're forced to travel over several distances and emit so that we can get to work or to get to play or to visit our neighbors. One of the areas I've already talked about a little bit is in investment, but this is also investments in areas like housing. What are the kind of permits that we give for housing size, insulation, and so on, as well as the need for new institutions that sort of embody the transitioning that we're thinking about. At the very center of this is the need to boost our capacity to imagine success differently and to imagine a future society that is not dependent upon consumerism as we see it today, but also giving people the capacity to get innovative in finding solutions, and governments in evolving sort of institutional and governance mechanisms that recognize the need for transition rather than holding us down to contemporary societal norms. At the very center of this are three key principles. The first one is to live within ecological boundaries. The second one is the principle of equity for everyone. And the third one is to make sure that a sustainable lifestyle provides well-being not only to the individual, but to the broader society and community. So I would leave it at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis. As usual, you have definitely eclipsed the evidence issue on lifestyles in 10 minutes, which, you know, is just fabulous. Remember, in introducing Louis, we mentioned that it's the importance around evidence, leadership, and motivating behavior change. And now I'd like to turn over the discussion to Malin Peterson-Beckman, Sustainability Communication and Engagement Manager of IKEA Group. For IKEA, sustainable living is at the core of their business. Go ahead, Malin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Garrett, and thank you, Louis. It was extremely interesting and valuable input, not least for IKEA. So I'm very happy to be part of the webinar. I'm Malin, and I'm Head of Sustainability Communications and Engagement at IKEA Group. Happy to be here to share the IKEA perspective. So the IKEA vision is to create a better everyday life for the many people. And that includes everyone across the IKEA value chain and beyond. And the many people expresses the IKEA promise to always side with people with thin wallets, wherever they are. And today, as you know, IKEA is one of the most well-known home furnishing brands. We have operations in more than 50 markets. And as a values-based business with focus on life at home, we have to have a people-centric approach at the heart of how we do business. And every year we connect with millions of people around the world, and we have conversations with people about their needs and dreams in their homes, in their kitchens, in their hallway, all the way to the bathroom and the bedroom. And from our research, we know that most people want to live more sustainable lives and healthy lives. And but one of the main barriers is that it's perceived to be too expensive, and it's also there is also a lack of attractive solutions. And very often you don't know what to do or where to start. You want more support from businesses and governments. And as you said, Garrett, I was just going to say the exact same thing. You know, people don't wake up in the morning and think about sustainability. You think about your daily needs, taking care of your family, and going to work. So sustainable living have to fit into all of that in a very easy way. So next, please. Next slide, yeah. So our starting point is that sustainable living can't be a luxury for a few people. And that's a global ambition relevant for all our markets. And today we know that people with thin wallets have the hardest time affording these kind of products and services. And of course, IKEA has a real possibility to change that. And our own overall ambition is to inspire and enable more than 1 billion people to live better lives within the boundaries of the planet by 2030. And of course, the current challenging situation with even more shrinking wallets, it's even more important to secure that sustainable living is affordable and easy and accessible. It should simply be the default option, the better design, the better solution. And this is for us a very much of a holistic approach. So it includes everything from the design of the products to the resource use, to the impact we have on climate, on biodiversity, on water use, on human rights. And it's about how our products are being used and reused and passed on at the end of life. And we need to have a positive impact on both people and the planet. And of course, it's also about how we meet our customers and how we inspire with our insights in life at home, and how we inspire like more new sustainable lifestyles and new, more sustainable consumption patterns. And with the IKEA business model and our reach, we see we have the both responsibility and the potential to democratize sustainability and bring as many people as possible along. Next, please. Next, yeah. So this image describes what we call democratic design, and it's the method that we use to develop products at a low price, but at the same time is our beautifully designed, well-functioning, of good quality and sustainable. And our ambition for all products and solutions that we offer is to maximize these 5 dimensions together. And it's not enough to make sustainable living affordable and accessible. It has to be attractive and desirable. I mean, if you have more of an emotional connection to things, you care more about what you have, and you want to know what happens to a product when you perhaps no longer want it and pass it on. Next, please. And throughout IKEA, we work actively to address big challenges, air pollution being one of the world's biggest health challenges. And here's an example from India, where we turn rice straw, a rice residue that traditionally is burned and contributes heavily to air pollution, into a renewable material source for IKEA products. So on the right-hand side, you see the IKEA collection Förändring, which means change in Swedish, and it's made from this rice straw. And I think a collection like this can enable customers and encourage customers to be part of a movement to tackle a big, complex challenge and support more sustainable living on a planet with cleaner air. Next, please. And another big challenge is, of course, water scarcity. And this new solution, which is still under development, it's a little mouthpiece that customers can fit onto their existing tap. And in all its simplicity, it can actually enable people to reduce more than up to 90% of the water use around activities around the tap in kitchen and bathrooms. And I think this also shows how the range can enable new behaviors. You don't need that much water to wash your hands. And it's been developed together with an external entrepreneur, and it also shows the role IKEA can play in scaling up innovative technologies and solutions, and thereby make them much more accessible and affordable to more people. Next. And IKEA is a very large food provider. Last year, around 680 million people experienced the IKEA food offer in our bistros or restaurants or IKEA food markets. And one example of how we want to inspire more people to choose a healthier and more sustainable lifestyle is by introducing plant-based food that is both delicious and affordable. And one of the first out was the veggie hot dog, which was launched 2 years ago, and it was very positively received. And soon we're introducing the plant-based alternative to the meatball, the iconic IKEA meatball. It tastes like meat, but it has a climate footprint which is 20% lower than the traditional meatball. Next. And then I'll also like to share some reflections on the current COVID-19 pandemic situation from an IKEA perspective. And of course, here and now, our focus has been on supporting and protecting the livelihoods of our co-workers, our suppliers, our customers, and our business partners, and also support communities where we operate. But taking a step back, we can actually see that trends that we saw already before the pandemic are becoming more evident. So the health and well-being of yourself, your family, your friends is becoming even more important. This, of course, resonates very much with the IKEA business and our ambition to develop more products that enable people to live more healthier lives. And at the same time, it's of course important to remember that we are in the middle of this change, and it's still too early to say how this is going to play out in the long run and how you are impacted is of course very dependent on your overall living situation and where you live. And as you said, Gareth, and I think also you, Louise, many people struggle to just meet basic needs. Next. And I think many of us can identify with having had to spend a lot of time at home during the past couple of months and this spring lockdown. So all of a sudden you have to do everything at home. And this has made the home become even more fluid, so to speak. You have to do everything under one roof. The home becomes a place for workspace, for homeschooling, for cooking, for resting, for exercise. You do everything in the same space. And for most people, this situation has been very tough. And especially if you live in small spaces where every family member has a different need. And then from a home furnishing perspective, we have seen an increased demand in office furniture and outdoor furniture and cookware. Next, please. And I mean, with the current situation and the overall global uncertainty at the moment, we see that it's more important than ever to not compromise our long-term sustainability ambitions. So we stay fully committed, and we've said that also, declare that externally, to transform into climate positive and circular business by 2030. And more than ever, it's important, like a business like IKEA is a positive force in society. And we will make sustainable living affordable and attractive for the many people. It's more relevant than ever to advocate for a circular society, where we need to do our part, of course, to enable customers to prolong the life of the products and take care of what you already have. And we will design all of our products from the very beginning to be repurposed, repaired, reused, and eventually recycled, generating as little waste as possible. And the aim is to use only renewable and recycled materials by 2030. And we're also testing new ways for customers to have their items repaired or refurbished and own products in new ways, like products as a service. And the whole circular agenda is, of course, very important also to decrease our climate footprint. So despite the here and now, we should not lose focus on the climate issue as well. It's not going to go away. We drastically need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms from all parts of the value chain, and continue to work with our suppliers across their entire factories, converting into renewable energy. Next, please. So, I mean, even if the situation of the global pandemic is very challenging, we see it also as a reminder that we need to come together and find new ways of working that will benefit both people and the planet for the future. And this is really an opportunity to rethink and recover and in new creative ways. And we try to lead by example. We try to be part of a systemic change. Doesn't exclude that we want to bring all customers along and engage as well across our business. We don't have all the answers. I mean, in our sustainability strategy, we have intentionally actually set commitments that we know we can't achieve alone. So it will only be possible if we work together. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Marla, for showing that sustainable living is at the core of IKEA Group. And I think it's a good sign of the leadership element of the series here. And now recognizing that with evidence and leadership, we also need to be able to motivate and engage change. I turn it over to Claire Tavernier, who is Senior Content and Digital Media Advisor, who has a focus on young people, diversity, and media-led behavior change. And she's been a producer at American Idol, Got Talent, X-Former, and a CEO of media for the NGO Girl Effect. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Can you hear me? I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm flattered and slightly bewildered to find myself on this panel because I don't know that much about sustainable living. I know about it from a consumer perspective, which I guess is always interesting, but I don't know about it from an expert perspective. My expertise is in stories, and you introduced me very kindly and used the word media. Media, as the word indicates, is the medium, and the real core of it is the story. The media is about telling stories, and you also mentioned, Gareth, at the beginning that sustainable living was very much about taking a people's lens, and you can't take a people's lens without stories. So my 10 minutes, although I guess I'm the last speaker, so I could just keep going. My 10 minutes is going to focus on stories, and if you click once through, please. Mostly their influence on social norms, because stories are what forms very much our understanding as people in terms of what social norms are. This is how social norms are passed on. They are passed on by stories that we tell our children, that we watch on TV, that we read books on, etc. This is a lot of the tension right now around, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement is around the fact that social norms don't leave enough space for Black lives in many of our Western countries, and that is because stories are shaping so much of the social norms. If you look at the next slide, one of the very first stories that we all learn is this one. And yes, it's called Little Red Riding Hood in this version, and it's a fairy tale that a lot of children listen to when they are in Europe. There are various versions around Europe, and then obviously in North America, but a very similar tale exists in Asia, except it's a tiger and not a wolf, and it's an aunt and not a granny, but the rest is pretty much the same. And there's an equivalent tale also in Africa with a wolf and kids. And the point of this whole tale is to say, don't trust strangers, even if they look like your granny, because they might eat you. That is the story. That's the story, is to tell children they can't just go off in the forest if their mom told them not to, and they can't necessarily trust strangers. And this is how we grow up. We grow up thinking about stories in that way. And of course, they could have had a poster, or I guess they didn't have the printing press, but some version of a poster in the doctor's surgery saying, don't trust strangers. But it would not have had the same impact as the story. More recently, if we go to the next slide, we have related to the lockdowns, the various lockdowns that we've all had to live through stories. Yes, we've had the government diktats of what we should do, what we should do and where, but really what we've heard are the stories, in this case in Rome, of neighbors on their balcony singing opera, stories of celebrities showing their gray hair because they can't get to a hairdresser, and you thinking, oh, thank God it's not just me. Stories also of exhausted frontline workers, which have been really important. We went into lockdown because we had to, because the government told us so, but we stayed and we followed the rules because of an emotional connection to the people. And this is how we learn to act. We learn to act through emotional connection. It was beautiful to see Malin's presentation with their beautiful pictures. The IKEA's catalogs are just always so incredibly well designed. And that's what they are creating, an emotional connection to these people, so that you want to go and buy the furniture, which sounds like very good business to me. So if we go to the next slide, you can divide stories into in this way we learn through stories into 3 different levels. The first one is the one that everybody knows about. It's about building awareness. But then there's also a more complex way in which stories work, which is about humanizing and allowing space for complex issues, which is where I think there's a real connection with the issue of sustainable living. And then finally, as we've talked about briefly, and we'll go through in more detail, stories normalize behaviors. But let's talk about building awareness first. If you go to the next slide, and specifically about oh, look, you've got Greta. There was Greta on the right. So yes, that's how most people think about media when we're talking about big issues, whether it's the environment or any others. It's about, enlisting celebrities, enlisting champions, and raising awareness. And it is important, by the way. Yes, there's Greta. Thank you. I mean, come on, I don't want to cut her off. But she is important. Greta is essential. She's saying, this is important to me, and I want you to care because it's important to me. Leonardo DiCaprio says, you know what? I can be a manly man and I can still drive a hybrid car. Why don't you do it? And those are very important. but they are, I'm not quite sure what the Kardashian lady's saying, but clearly green is the new black. But I'm not entirely sure. Sorry, these are very, very important things, but they can get quite confusing. And if we move off Greta and go to the next slide, which doesn't matter if it's cut off, so you can just put it back on, you won't understand it anyway, even in big form. This is a chart I found on the internet. Sorry, I didn't find the credit. This is how complex it gets. There's a third option on the right that you can't see, which says oceans, and it's got Pierce Brosnan attached to it. And you're like, okay, well, that's a lot of celebrities, some of which I relate to, some of which I don't, and they all have some sort of connection with various issues, some of them to one more than one. I get a bit confused now. Yes, clearly the environment is really important, but I'm not quite sure what it all means. And that's where you actually need more. And if we go to the next slide, we're going to get to I think my favorite still today, my favorite way of using celebrity to increase awareness of an issue, because it's actually a story. It's not just a celebrity championing a cause. It's Princess Diana in 1987 shaking the hand of an AIDS patient with no gloves on. And that's a beautiful moment there, because it's not just Princess Diana going out there saying, you know, I support AIDS patient, AIDS research, all of this. This is her acting and creating the story. And then people said this, they said if a royal princess can shake the hand of a patient's hand, of an AIDS patient, and they're letting her do it, well, it must be okay. So, you know, you've moved on here from endorsement and championing, and you're moving into emotional connection, you're moving to humanization, you're moving to my next category, which I think is really the part where the sustainable living has so much to do, and has so much more that they could do by working with media and storytellers. So if we move to the issue of humanizing in the next slide, this is much more complex, actually, humanization, because it needs space. It needs more in-depth stories. Essentially, it needs long form. It needs books. It needs movies. It needs TV series, because then you can humanize. You can create a long-term emotional connection. This poster here on the right is a movie called Pink, which was quite groundbreaking when it came out, because it humanized the issue of sexual assault for the first time, and it gave a lot of space to the story. It interrogated, because it's a trial, like so many of these movies, it allowed, the trial settings are brilliant for that, because it allows somebody to be the bad guy and say, well, she was looking for it, she was going out, she was wearing those clothes, and all of these issues can actually be discussed and formed and rationalized and talk through, and you create a real connection. This isn't just a girl wearing a short skirt or whatever. It's a girl who is somebody's daughter, somebody's friend. This movie is now being shown to police forces in a number of districts in India as training tool, and this is the power of the story. And it's not the only one, of course. There are lots and lots of them. The soaps have done a really great job of doing this. If we go to the next slide, this is another example from Africa, MTV Sugar, which talked about HIV and safe sex, using condom to young people. It was started in Kenya. It was aired in 40 countries across Africa. Recently, a British soap ran a really long storyline on coercive control, which is this domestic abuse, which isn't physical, which is about taking control away from the person that's being abused. And again, because it was a soap, because those were very familiar characters, they could draw out the conversation, which is the same conversation you would have at home. Is it abused? It's not physical, she can leave. All of these things can be discussed. And it's the same with the issues of sustainable living, which are extremely complex, extremely diffuse, and not a sort of black and white issue. You need the space and you need the emotional connection to allow people to really experience them. Looking at the next slide, just another example. We don't have to go through them in too much detail, but these were another example of humanizing the lockdown. You know, obviously this was the cover of Vogue. They found the best looking health workers that there was in the world, obviously, and put them on their cover. But it's the same issue, which is these are the real heroes. This is why you're in lockdown. Let's talk about them. It's all about the issues. And now going to the next slide, this is the research. I just typed movies about sustainable living on Google, and this is what came out. And those are beautiful movies. I've actually seen some of them. They're brilliant. But what I'm not seeing is the little girl dying from a chemical spill, the baby whale, Tom Hanks dancing with Antonio Banderas. I'm not seeing anybody's daughters, anybody's friend, anybody's little brother. There's no emotional connection, and you're not going to create the movement that you're trying to create without that emotional connection, because we're human and that's how we work. So, moving on quickly, because I am conscious of time. When stories, have been integrated and internalized, you can move into social norm change, and that's brilliant. That's what media also does very well. This guy is James Bond. He used to be a chain smoking, 60 cigarettes a day in the books, heavy drinking, sports cars driving, usually drinking and driving at the same time. He was pretty sexist, was quite racist, not a great gay, supporter. Well, yeah, it's James Bond circa 1962. It's not James Bond today. James Bond doesn't smoke anymore. He doesn't drink and drive. Consent is a very big issue in James Bond movies. They're being very careful. Moneypenny is black, Emmett's a woman, or was a woman, and Q is younger than James now. And they have this is a new social norm. This is what people are expecting, even from that tough, muscled action hero. So it's, you can change social norms and you can represent new social norms on TV very efficiently. Now, if we go to the next slide, unfortunately, this is current social norms. This is the current shortcut. As much as, the old shortcut was that the heavy smoking, heavy drinking, guy was the hero. Now it's the harried young woman carrying lots of disposable cups of coffee. Oh my God, she must be important. Or it's the Nigerian hip hop star in his Lamborghini Urus, which is worth $300,000. I'll have you know. These aren't the images you want to show as an example of what's cool. When people go into supermarkets on TV, it's always large supermarkets. It's easier to film in them. Water tends to be drunk from a bottle. There's none of these things aren't the things that we want to promote. Working from home, shared spaces, urban farms, all of this, that's not being shown as the new normal yet, or not enough. It's still happening, and I'm just going to finish with this last example, which I'm not sure many of you necessarily know, but it's a TV show called Queer Eye. It's a makeover show, and it came out first. There was a first version 20 years ago, and then there's recently rebooted. The guys at the bottom are the rebooted version of Queer Eye on Netflix, and there's been a lot of talk about this show for various good reasons, but what people don't talk about is the new normal in this new version of the show, which is that actually they go to farmers market. You can't see one disposable water bottle or coffee cup. Nobody's drinking from straws. They're talking a lot about natural ingredients for cleaning, etc. The guy that does the makeover of the house is reusing a lot of these. These have all been integrated into the storylines in a way that I haven't actually been able to find an article about it, yet they are showing it as their new normal. And so storytellers are already out there trying to change behaviors, trying to promote sustainable ways of living. They just don't necessarily have all the tools and all the information. And for this, they need you guys. You are amazing. You are all out there doing this amazing job, doing this amazing research, but you need to decide whether you're going to wait for humanity to get with a program and start listening to science and research, or whether you're going to take them along for the ride, hold their hands, and make them care and connect through stories. And I would say stories win. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire, so much. And so as much as I would say that Lewis sort of covered the evidence around the research, I think you've done the same around what is media and how to bring people along there. I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them into the question box. In the meantime, I'd like to ask a question, if you don't mind, and it would be to Lewis. So Lewis, with Claire and Malin, to a certain extent, because IKEA also looks at communications and outreach as part of what their work is, we've now heard about this role of media and cultural influencers on changing behavior. What are your thoughts about that, and how that might play into the importance of evidence? Because just doing evidence for its own sake, how can it better feed into storytelling?
Thank you very much, Garrett, and thank you, Malin and Claire. I don't know. I should have come after you guys. That way I don't feel quite terrible about myself now, giving terrible messages out there with horrible numbers. But you would agree with me, first of all, that IKEA, you're in an exceptional situation. You don't have the pressures of reporting your profits every 3 months and to compete in this corporate get all or lose all world where most other corporations are competing. And you have a sort of luxury to, which is a bit unusual. That said, I'm not saying this because I want to take it for granted. You have actually discovered with that you can do lots of good things with it, and you're fidgeting around, you're experimenting, and you're trying out these new things, which most organizations are not. But I dare say you've raised a culture of your a leadership culture of sustainability, which is not very usual in the corporate world as we see now. It's the same thing we're seeing with the media. It is so corporatized that the messages of sustainability, for them to be able to come through, they need to be a product that is sold to people. And this is such a perversion of what our system promotes. At the very center of this is an issue of institutional leadership. We don't have it. We've raised this huge thing of people having unsustainable lifestyles, having to buy everything, and we've said it's not good. The dream they have is not good. They need to change it. And then we've left them alone to their own devices. People are frustrated, paralyzed, overwhelmed, and all the institutions that we depend on pretty much go, let people change their lifestyles. It's quite a perversion. On the one hand, giving this kind of a message, and then on the other hand, not putting out the support systems that are needed for this. So part of what I'm heading at here is I'm so happy that UNEP is taking this topic on, and I hope that it gets even bigger within the work you're doing, because we need institutional leadership here. What I also would like to say in terms of communication, and I like so much what Claire has said, and part of the subtext here is we are driven by a very tunnel shaped vision, and it's all about the economy. We need to get out of that. Our media messages do not have to be about the economy. Our everyday reality of meeting people and exchanging goods and services doesn't have to be about the economy. It can be about neighborhoods. It could be about sharing. It could be about lots of other elements that are shaped by our norms in society that are not all about exchanging money and growing the GDP or going to the shopping mall. And as soon as we start putting this kind of numbers, as we've seen today, having them shifted around or amplified by the media messages, the sooner people actually get it, not from a point of paralysis, but from a point of an understanding of what new norms could emerge, what future visions could emerge, what future communities could be there that embody the kind of value systems that we are talking about. Right now, that narrative is completely missing. So someone like me looks quite terrible on a panel talking about slashing by 75%, and the images don't look very fancy. So
Thank you, Louis. And so I'm also asking participants if they'd like to ask questions to please feel free to put some in. We've gotten some questions that are fairly technical about different presentations that were made, particularly Louis's, on some details. So if we have time, we'll get to those in the end. Make sure that we'll be sure to get back to whoever the questions on what the response is. But I'd like to turn the question over to Malin, because you've had two different sort of references to the work that you've been doing. If you have any response to some of the points that Louis brought up, that's certainly of interest. But also, given that people are seeing IKEA as sort of a new business model that's out there that puts people more at the center of its strategy, would you have advice for other companies or maybe young entrepreneurs that are starting out on how they can adapt to this new normal?
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit difficult to say. I mean, we have, as I said before, to create a change, we all need to play different roles. I mean, IKEA, for example, joins forces with entrepreneurs at times where entrepreneurs can bring the innovation and we can bring the scalability and production techniques and so on. So I think there's really not one solution, but of course, keeping in mind that if you really want to have a big impact on a large scale, I believe it has to be affordable, a sustainable solution. If you develop a sustainable solution, it has to be affordable, scalable. And then there is, of course, also a value of creating awareness around a topic through a limited collection, or using an influencers that more exclusivity around a topic, and that can also create engagement. So, but that would inspire perhaps bigger change, and you need both to some extent. So it depends a bit what you want to achieve. I think in IKEA we have a very strong culture, and I think the trust that we try to establish within the business, which also has to do with this people-centric approach, also sort of frees up a lot of creativity, and also daring to do mistakes. And so the leadership approach, being people-centric and trying and testing new things, I think that's also something that I would encourage others to do.
Thank you. So now the questions are coming in, so there's lots to go. And so the next one is going to be for Claire. One would be, could you, now that you've sort of outlined how important storytelling is, but you've also heard from the evidence of what the issues are out there, as well as a company that's really tried to operationalize what sustainable living is, how do you see would be a way that media could pick up more of this evidence, and we could make the link to that? Because I'm sure some of the companies that are working in that are doing what they can find out, but maybe the linkages to evidence aren't that strong. I don't know if you have any reflections. And the second question was, what is your favorite story related to climate change and why, if you have one?
Okay, those are brilliant and slightly scary. I don't know about the climate change. The first thing that comes up for me are some of those very stark dystopian movies like Children of Men, which I actually think in a very negative way. I mean, Children of Men, I don't know if you remember that movie, that's quite a long time ago, was, presented, it was a science fiction movie, but it presented a world where all women had become, all children had died, there were no more children. And it really stuck with me. And I think it's often in these science fiction, fantasy, dystopian movies that you're going to find the parables and the images that really allow you to go a little bit further than that, because you can go to the extreme scenario. You can say, well, look at that, you really fucked it up now. This is where we are now. Or the last image of Planet of the Apes, when you see the Statue of Liberty and you're like, oh shit. I think those are really, yes, they are the scary scarecrow, but they're also important because obviously you don't want to only have bad things, but it's also important to see that. Thinking about it, the other one that I love is Princess Mononoke by Studio Ghibli. And some of the Studio Ghibli movies, they're all very influenced by nature. They're not specifically about climate change, but they all present the opposite. They present an image of what might happen if we got it right, which I think it's nice to have both. Going back to your first question, so evidence is a bit tricky, because evidence doesn't necessarily make for good TV. And remember, I'm not talking about publicizing the research. I'm talking about integrating some of the themes of sustainable living into stories that will make people really important and care. So it's this evidence, I've mostly worked in the gender diversity world rather than the climate change world. So maybe I'll give a few examples from that. It doesn't really help to give stats about domestic abuse. It doesn't really, people look at them and they don't relate to them. If a character that they care about goes through it, and then at the end of that, there is a stat, then you're like, oh my God, you mean 20% are, there's 1 in 5. And it's also about how you present those findings. So I think if you want, and I do think there's a lot of work to do to educate storytellers into how they can integrate sustainable living themes into what they do. I think it's less about inundating them with research. Most of them are not very good with numbers, let me tell you, because I've worked with them a lot. But it's about educating them to a point where they start taking this and making it their own. And yes, it will mean relinquishing control. And sometimes it won't be perfect. I've talked about the movie Pink, and there was a lot of backlash about it to some extent because it still presents a patriarchal society, and there are things that aren't right with it, but it's there and it's making people think, and you're not going to get it perfect. So I think part of it for experts is to be able to sort of let go a little bit of the idea that you're going to be able to communicate the whole perfect case for it. That's not what will happen. What ideally should happen is that you'll start brainstorming with people who come from a very, very different background and a very different practice, and something will emerge which will have themes that relate to what you do. Don't know if that really answers the question. That's all I have.
Well, that's good. I mean, believe me, right now I have to tell you that there are all kinds of questions coming in about how you would summarize this webinar in a movie and who you would cast as each of you. So I want you to know.
I thought you were going to ask me which of the Queer Eye guys is my favorite, but I'm not going to.
Now, I just put that up because
maybe build on what you said, Claire, because I think, yeah, you're really onto something. You know, if you really want to change behaviors, we have to inspire, and that's where we try to put our focus: inspire and enable. And that, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't, you know, inform and be transparent about the sustainability credentials and our impact and so on. But it's a balance for a business like IKEA to not get trapped into the labeling slide that you showed, Louis, I think, and be transparent, but at the same time, really not sort of over-inform and tell
and
stories.
Preachy. Nobody wants preachy. Preachy does not sell.
No,
it doesn't sell stories. It doesn't sell themes. It's not so much about selling products. It doesn't. Preachy doesn't work. People don't like to get preached at.
But I also really like what you said, Louis, about, you know, it's not focusing on individual products, but the whole better living idea. So how can we, you know, together with others, and it's not IKEA telling people how they should live their lives, but how can we facilitate more to paint a more tangible, visionary picture of what a better life looks like that is, you know, within the boundaries of the planet. And I think that's where we are testing and trying. Of course, it also has to be locally relevant, so it's not sort of a global solution that you roll out. But I think that's how we see it from our perspective.
Part of the reflection I'm having here as we talk through this is the fact that we need to realize that what we are doing here, we're competing with so many other stakeholders about what a possible future of society would be. This is essentially what we're doing. We're saying there's a possible vision that is a bit away from products. It's a bit more closer to well-being and happiness and so on. And there are other people who are saying, oh no, that's not true. This future is tied to your credit card and to bank loans and to no more Amazon forest and all of that. And there are other people who are saying at the same time, yeah, it doesn't really matter. Let's just get our alcohol and go home and retire. I have different wording for this, but I'm aware that this is a UN webinar, so I'm not going to use the kind of wording that comes to my mind right now. But essentially, this is a contest for what future society should be like and what we should put at the center of how we, be it sell or promote or drive a change towards that. And I dare say, right now, the argument is the direction where we're going is not going to lead us to a future where anyone is happy, or at least where most of the people are happy. It's not going there. And the question we're asking is, how do we change course? Now, we're changing course in so many ways. We're changing course by buying onto existing ideologies that are in this contemporary society, which we want to change. And I would say this is part of a limitation of what we have done. We've just seen numbers of how consumption is driving us, is eating up into that future that we want to communicate or sell to people. We've seen those numbers, and yet we're still debating how within the same paradigm we should use that same system and method to sell something which we've not been able to sell. And I can't help wondering, are we ignoring how urgent and huge and complex this problem is by simply looking around us and picking up the same things? Can we find a more sincere, a more humane way of gradually putting this system to sleep and finding an alternative to it? Can we not rush to bail out companies now that have sort of going out of business due to COVID-19 lockdown? Can we not instinctively rush to bail them out and let them go away, and we see what comes out of it? Can we dare to say we don't need to be in the office from 9 to 7 every day and find what alternative comes of it. Can we dare to say healthcare, or can we dare to say the care economy, taking care of the kids, of the elderly in society? They don't need to become commodified such that we're building places that they sell these services to families. There's something a bit trapping about that. I feel there's something a bit trapping about how we're going about this conversation. I don't mean us here, I mean in general, how in the community we're going about this conversation. We're held by the same standards of today's society, which is quite problematic, rather than already trying to live the system and the standards and the value orientation that we see towards 2050. I'm not creative enough to come up with a solution here, but I do hope that gives a certain reflection towards how we're seeking change or finding solutions.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, Louis, thank you so much for that. We have a few more minutes before the webinar ends, and actually that's a really good sort of, if we could think of it as a closing comment on how you envision the future and some of the challenges that we have out there. I want to note that we have gotten so many questions for not only Claire and a variety of the media contexts, but also for Malin finding out more about how IKEA is doing things, as well as with Louis on some of the specifics on what's happening. Could I take the last few minutes we have and ask Malin and Claire to maybe offer some reflections on today's conversation? And if possible, you know, the purpose of today was to offer visions for the future, and I think we've been doing that somewhat throughout the thing. But if you were to be launching how the movement on sustainable living is happening, what do you think there needs to be more of? Who else needs to be engaged? And offer your reflections. Malin, would you like to start off?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think really need to work, you know, at many different levels with stakeholders across society to really, you know, put the system to sleep, as you said, Louis. I mean, if you look at our footprint, we have 42% in our material sits with our materials, for example. So we really need to, and 6% of the total sits with the glue that we use. So, I mean, we really need to be able to focus on those things that really have an impact. And then we need to be part of, you know, transforming whole society into a circular society. And then we also need to continue to inspire and engage with customers and co-workers and make sure that enable them to be part of this movement that is already happening. And how can IKEA sort of accelerate that and become a clear sort of partner based on, you know, the closest we have to people in life at home, and also being present in our supply chain and really have the possibility to have a positive impact across, you know, different markets and supply chains. So I think all of these things need to happen at the same time.
Claire, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think today was brilliant, and I so enjoyed both Louis and Malin's presentations, and I think it confirmed what I already knew or suspected, which is that the problem is urgent, but it's also incredibly complex and difficult to communicate. And that is its curse in a way. It's because it's there, it's urgent, we need to do something, but the something is not very clear. And especially the something at an individual level, as per Louis's presentation, is sort of both confusing, and you read it, yeah, it doesn't matter anymore whether, you know, it's difficult for people to feel ownership of the problem. So I think as the media professional, as the storyteller, I would want to take that and turn it into something that you can communicate around. And yes, it means there's horrible things that you will roll your eyes about, which, you know, it's spin, storytelling, finding a way to tell this story in a way that matters to people, so they understand why it's important and how much they can contribute, and how much they can contribute individually, but also as a family and as a community. And I think it starts with young people, and I think it has started already, but there's much more to be done.
That's great. Thank you so much. So as we come to the conclusion of the webinar, I'd just like to offer a few insights, because I think when Claire mentions, you know, we need to figure out exactly what to do, I think the wealth, when you look at the experts who are involved in the sustainable living area and those domains, that information is there. Of course, it's at a global level and it needs to be adapted for a local context, but the information is there. And part of it is some of the sponsors of the different webinar series, the One Planet Network and the various programs who are working in different lifestyle areas have some of that information. But clearly the bridge needs to be made better between having that information, making it available, and making it actionable, motivating, and engaging. So with that, I'd like to thank specifically the three presenters today, Louis, Malin, and Claire, so much for being here. From the wealth of questions that we've gotten from the different people here, I see that the discussions have really resonated with many people here. And I would also like to take this opportunity to invite you to the next of the webinar series, which is called, it's on July 7th, and it's called There's No Place Like Home, Cities Making Sustainable Living a Reality, because in each of the different webinar series that we have, we go into many of the topics that we've brought up today when we've talked about the visions of the future. In essence, many of these visions already have granular seeds that are happening, and it's up to us to figure out how we can all coalesce and work together in new stakeholder organizations so that we can make things happen. So with that, I'd like to thank you again. It's been a real pleasure to have you all here, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks. Going.